Sometimes a hero arrives without a name badge, without an invite, and without applause. Just a silent memory and a single flower. In a world ruled by protocols, one quiet man defied them all. Not with protest, but with patience. This is secure area, sir. Military funeral, 4-star general, no clearance, no entry. The guard didn't really look. Just another aging man in a time-worn uniform, out of place and forgotten. He didn't protest. He simply stood there, holding a slightly wilted white lily in his hand. Inside the gates, cameras clicked, medals sparkled, and flags flew for a national icon. No one noticed the man on the other side. No one, except one general who stopped the entire ceremony just to come out and salute him. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where we honor the power of compassion and where even forgotten heroes are finally remembered. The sky above Quantico, Virginia, was overcast with that muted gray that softens everything it touches. Early autumn had begun to brush the hilltops with rusty reds and faded golds. American flags fluttered gently along the road to the cemetery gates, rustling like soft-spoken reminders of duty. Inside, a crowd had gathered. Generals, diplomats, decorated soldiers, everyone polished and precise, faces set in reverent stillness. This wasn't just any service. It was the state funeral of General Marcus R. Connors, a 4-star Titan who'd once led elite U.S. operations across continents. His name was etched into history books, his honors the highest the country could bestow. Security was relentless. ID badges gleamed under scanners, names were double-checked, even retired officers weren't admitted without official clearance. Not even Franklin Hayes. Far from the cameras near the edge of the gate stood a man alone. His back was slightly bent, his uniform decades old but clean and carefully arranged. Its original forest green had faded closer to ash blue, and the brass buttons had dulled, but every crease was pressed, every line in place. His boots were polished, his cap set just right. No ribbons on his chest, just one forgotten unit patch on his shoulder. In his weathered hands he held the lily. Wrapped gently in a strip of cloth, he had taken a bus. A 5-hour ride from Roanoke, then a transfer in Richmond, and finally a local route that left him 3/4 of a mile from the gates. No calls, no escort, just one man making good on a promise. As he neared the entrance, step by slow step, a young security officer stepped into his path. "I'm sorry, sir. This service is private. You need special clearance." Franklin blinked slowly. His eyes were a faded blue, clouded with age, but still steady. "I just came to pay my respects," he said quietly. The guard frowned. "Only authorized guests, sir. Are you family?" Franklin shook his head. "I served with him a long time ago." The guard scanned him again. His creased hands, his tired shoes, the single flower. "I'm sorry, sir. Without documentation, I can't let you in." Franklin didn't argue. He simply nodded and moved aside, taking a quiet place near the wall. There he stood, unmoving, as the wind gently tugged at his sleeve. Inside, the funeral began. Rows of brass, polished shoes, folded flags, the haunting sound of bagpipes floated in the air. And beyond it all, outside the perimeter, behind the iron gate, Franklin Hayes waited. Not angry, not expectant, just there. But he had been seen. Colonel Logan Marks, once an aide to General Connors, caught sight of him through the bars. Something about that uniform, and the patch. He leaned closer. Vietnam, Reconnaissance Battalion, Ghost Company, a unit that hadn't officially existed in over 50 years. It couldn't be. But there he was, Franklin Hayes, the man his former commander once claimed had saved his life. Twice. Logan leaned toward the general beside the casket. "Sir, he's here." General Michael Thurman turned. "Hayes," and without hesitation he handed off his saber, squared his uniform, and strode toward the gate. The musicians halted. The honor guard froze. Even the crowd collectively held its breath. The general opened the gate himself and stepped outside. Franklin, still unmoving after half an hour, looked up, puzzled. General Thurman stopped just feet from him. Then, standing at full attention, he saluted. Sharp. Clean. The kind reserved only for equals. Sir, he said, voice heavy with feeling. We've been waiting for you. Franklin hesitated. You don't have to. With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, the general cut in. Yes, I do. From behind him, the colonel approached, carrying a polished wooden box. In front of press, politicians, and fellow officers, General Thurman placed the box into Franklin's hands. The ashes of General Marcus R. Connors, he said. He asked for you to bring him home. To the brothers the headlines never mentioned, but who saved lives no one ever recorded. Franklin's hand trembled. I thought they'd forgotten, he whispered. The general's voice cracked. We didn't. Sometimes respect doesn't come through speeches or ceremonies. It walks in silence in the long shadows of men who never asked to be remembered, but were. Inside the cemetery, the ceremony continued. But at its edge, where the gravel met the green, something unforgettable was unfolding. Franklin Hayes, with the ashes of a fallen general in his trembling hands, stood just beyond the boundary. As he stepped forward, the silence deepened. Behind him, others began to stir. From their chairs rose the remaining members of Ghost Company, veterans now in their 70s and 80s, weathered and gray, but standing tall. One by one, they came to attention, not because a program told them to, not because cameras were rolling, but because they knew. And as Franklin passed them, carrying the remains of General Marcus Connors, each one raised a hand in solemn salute. This was not for medals, not for show. It was for memory. Because some debts aren't listed in records or printed in programs. They're carried deep and quiet until someone finally says, "Welcome home." The breeze shifted. Franklin crossed the cemetery threshold. The weight in his arms was more than ceremonial. It was personal. The life he carried had once depended on him. Now, decades later, that same life asked to return by his hand. General Thurman walked beside him, silent. No interviews, no gestures, just two men, walking with purpose, one holding a past the world had nearly forgotten. There were no cameras now, no microphones, just the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the hushed rustle of officers standing to attention. But not for the general, for Franklin. He stopped short of the canopy where the formal service waited. In that pause, his mind slipped backward into another time, February 1968, Khe Sanh Combat Base. They called it a siege. 77 days of hell. Artillery pounding, bunkers collapsing, and nights so thick with smoke you couldn't tell fog from fire. Franklin was in his second tour, already a seasoned sergeant at 29. Older than most, fast under fire, smart, under pressure. It was the 34th night of the siege when the mortar started again. Explosions painted the sky near the runway. His radio crackled with panic. "This is Line Connors. My comms guys hit. We're outside the wire. Taking fire from the tree line." Franklin didn't wait for orders. Didn't hesitate. He grabbed 2 smoke grenades, clipped a flare to his vest, and ran. No cover. No backup. Just gut instinct. He found them crouched near a crumbling shack. One was bleeding out, the other shielding him with a sidearm and sheer will. The second man, a young lieutenant barely out of West Point, was barking commands like someone trying to convince himself he still had control. Beside him lay Marcus Connors, bloodied, limping, still trying to drag his radio. "You boys lose." "Your map?" Franklin muttered, tossing smoke between them in the jungle. "Who the hell are you?" the lieutenant asked. Franklin didn't answer. He just grabbed their jackets and pulled. Tracer rounds hissed through the haze. The jungle exploded behind them. But somehow, through instinct and fire, Franklin got them back over the wire. By the time he dropped them to safety, he was bleeding. 2, a deep gash across his shoulder. He never even noticed. He received a citation for valor, never claimed it, refused the medal, declined the commendation, dodged the camera. "I just did what I was supposed to," he said. And then, after his final tour, Franklin Hayes vanished from military life into the kind of silence only certain men know how to keep. Back in Quantico, present day, a folded letter sat heavy in his pocket. The last message from Marcus Connors, handwritten, heartfelt, and hidden until now. Franklin didn't pull it out. Not yet. The crowd was starting to move again. Uniformed aides passed out programs, flags folded with surgical precision. Guests were being guided to reception tents at the far end of the cemetery. But Franklin didn't follow. He never fit into reception lines. Never tried to. Instead, he stepped under a cluster of sycamores just off the path where he could watch in peace. He was alone again, until a voice interrupted. "Excuse me, sir?" Franklin turned. A young lieutenant stood there, clipboard in hand. Maybe 23, not a day older. Nervous, neat. Too young to understand what he was seeing. "I didn't see your name on the list," he said, checking his sheet. "Are you with the family?" Franklin shook his head. "No press, no military assignment," he said. Then after a beat, 3rd Recon Battalion, Charlie Company, Quezon, 1968. The lieutenant blinked, clearly not understanding. I'm sorry, sir, that's not—" "It wouldn't be," Franklin interrupted softly. He didn't explain further. No badge, no title, just memory. "I'm not here for the program," he added. The young officer hesitated, then awkwardly said, "I'll check with my CO," and walked off. Franklin turned back to the rows of flags behind the white canopy. Quiet again. Still. But someone else had been watching. Another officer, mid-40s, steady-eyed, a bronze star gleaming. On his chest had seen the exchange, and he had seen something else. General Andrew Price had also looked toward the tree line, twice. And then, without a word, the captain turned and walked toward the command tent. Not every uniform tells its story. Some are stitched with silence, but every once in a while the silence is broken, and what steps forward changes everything. 10 minutes later, something began to shift. It started subtly. A murmur near the edge of the tent, then a movement from the security team, and finally, an unmistakable change in posture among the highest-ranking officers in attendance. The 4-star general had stepped outside, not from a private back entrance. Not with aides flanking him, alone. Straight through the center of the reception tent. Calm, deliberate. Eyes fixed on the edge of the field, not toward the casket or the press risers, but toward the man in the faded green uniform. Franklin didn't move as General Andrew Price approached. But the air shifted around them. A hush spread like a wave. Guests looked up, a few raised phones, hesitated. Some just stared, unsure of what they were witnessing. General Price stopped at the gate. He removed his white gloves. Then, in one seamless motion, he lifted his hand in salute. To Franklin Hayes. To the man standing outside the perimeter, wearing a uniform most had forgotten, holding nothing but a flower and a weight that had never left his shoulders. The salute held, and when it lowered, Price stepped forward, one step, then another, until he was face to face with the man who, more than 50 years earlier, had carried him out of the fire. No words were exchanged at first. Then General Price spoke, his voice low, firm, but reverent. "I told Marcus I'd find Dewey," he said. He never stopped looking, and when he knew his time was running out, he left one last request. Franklin stayed quiet. His eyes, weathered but clear, met the general's. They no longer saw a young officer scrambling through jungle mud, but a leader who had carried that night with him ever since. General Price nodded to an aide, who stepped forward with a polished wooden box. The urn. Inside were the remains of General Marcus Connors, and there, in full view of the Secretary of Defense, top brass, and half the Pentagon, Andrew Price handed the ashes over, not to a family member, not to another general, but to Franklin Hayes, a man without medals, without a name tag, but not without honor. Camera shutters clicked, but Price raised his hand and stopped them cold. Then he turned toward the platform, where the podium waited for a rehearsed eulogy. Instead, he walked up alone, lifted the microphone, and spoke without notes, no ceremony, No script, just truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady and rising across the open field. "There are moments in a soldier's life that go far beyond medals or missions. Moments that define who we really are, not by what we wear, but by what we remember." He turned slightly, extending his hand behind him toward Franklin. "If not for this man," Price said, "General Marcus Connors would have died at 19. I would have never survived my first command. And everything we've accomplished since, the soldiers trained, the missions completed, it would never have happened." Franklin stood silently, holding the urn with the same quiet strength that once carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire. Price's voice wavered, just slightly. "If there is one person who deserves to lead this final walk," he said, "it is Sergeant Franklin Hayes, Ghost Recon, Laos, 1971. A long, solemn pause followed. Then, first a single clap, then another, and then slowly the entire audience stood. Generals, colonels, veterans, and civilians. They didn't clap for show, they rose for respect. Dozens of hats came off, hands lifted to brows in salute, and all the cameras were lowered, not because someone ordered it, but because everyone knew. This wasn't a moment to capture, it was a moment to witness. Price turned to Franklin, his voice now soft again. "Will you walk with me, Sergeant?" Franklin hesitated, just for a breath. Then he nodded. Together, shoulder to shoulder, they began the long walk toward the platform. They passed through rows of officers in full dress, past the press risers, past the cameras. As they reached the final row, the honor guard stepped aside, not because protocol said so, but because it was right. Franklin stepped onto the stage. He placed the urn above the folded flag. No ceremony. No flourish, just purpose, because some men don't need medals pinned to their chest to be remembered. They just need one person to say, "I never forgot you." The last note of taps faded into the wind. No applause followed, no anthem. Just silence, the kind that carries weight, the kind that speaks louder than sound. Franklin stood beside the pedestal. His hand rested on the urn. Not as a mourner, not as a guest, as a brother in arms, as the last piece of a promise fulfilled. General Price gave a small signal. Franklin lifted the box again. You don't need medals to be honored. Sometimes the most powerful salute is silent. Sometimes the loudest respect is the stillness of 1,000 people standing for someone they were never told to remember. Franklin Hayes took the first step, forward. The urn in his arms held not like a relic but like a brother. On either side of the walkway, the honor guard stood sharp in full ceremonial dress. Marines, sailors, airmen, soldiers, shoulders squared, backs straight. But their attention wasn't for the casket, not for the brass, not even for the general walking beside Franklin. It was for him. Franklin walked through their ranks, steady and silent. They didn't glance at the flag. They didn't look at the podium. They watched him, the old man in the faded green uniform, carrying something too sacred for ribbons, and they saluted. Not the urn, him. And it didn't stop with the honor guard. As Franklin walked further, veterans seated among the guests began to rise. Old men in civilian clothes with military patches on their jackets stood beside their canes. Some struggled to their feet. Others took off their hats with hands that trembled. A few cried, but none said a word. It wasn't part of the ceremony. It wasn't on any program. It was something deeper, a kind of remembering this world rarely makes room for, a shared recognition, not of what was earned, but of what was endured. By the time Franklin reached the family section, the entire cemetery had risen, every camera lowered, every whisper stopped, and in that perfect stillness, under the shadow of history, beside the men and women who had lived it, Franklin Hayes stood as the most honored man on that field. He didn't bow, didn't shed a tear. He simply walked, one deliberate step at a time, a walk that had started decades earlier in the muck of Laos, a walk that ended here, escorted by silence, carried by reverence, remembered without applause. Later, long after the guests had departed, After the folding chairs were stacked and the flags returned to their posts, Franklin remained. He stood under the tall oaks at the gravesite. The ashes had been interred. A fresh marker sat in the grass. Nothing showy, just a clean headstone with one simple inscription: Jenier Marcus R. Connors, brother, commander, friend. Franklin slowly lowered himself to his knees. His joints protested, but he didn't rush. From his pocket, he pulled a small stick of incense, one he'd carried unbroken for years. He lit it. The thin line of smoke curled upward into the crisp air, dancing between golden leaves. He didn't speak loudly, but if anyone had been close enough, they might have heard him whisper, "Told you I'd make it." A pause. "You always hated flowers." He smiled just slightly, then whispered again, "Rest easy, kid." He bowed his head once, in quiet respect. When he stood slowly with a soft grunt of effort, he didn't turn to walk away, because someone was already standing behind him. General Price, still in full dress uniform, still carrying the day on his shoulders. He stepped forward and extended a small envelope, aged, yellowed at the edges, sealed by time. Franklin took it cautiously. "What's this?" he asked. Price's voice was quiet. It was in Connor's personal safe. He left orders, "Only give it to you if you made it all the way here." Franklin stared at it for a moment. The paper crinkled as he opened it. Inside was just one paragraph, written like it had taken years to finish. "Frank, you never let me thank you. Not really. You saved my life and then vanished like it didn't mean anything. But it did. You're the only debt I ever carried that no medal, no command, no ceremony could repay. Because of you, I lived long enough to lead, to serve, and to die at peace. And if there's any justice left, one day they'll say my name beside yours. And maybe then, I'll feel like I earned it. Your friend, me." Franklin lowered the letter slowly. Then, with care, folded it back into its envelope and tucked it inside his coat pocket. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said softly. "I know," Price replied. "That's why you deserve it. Some honors are etched in metals, others are carved into stone. But the ones that last, the ones that truly matter, live in the way a life echoes through others." 1 year later, the crowd gathered again, this time under a bright spring sky. Dozens of veterans had returned, some in wheelchairs, others on canes, a few standing tall in their uniforms, a bit tighter now, but still sharp. Local officials filled folding chairs. Reporters clustered near the front. A color guard stood ready with flags catching sunlight. Behind them, across freshly trimmed grass, a bronze plaque glinted on a tall stone archway. The Franklin Hayes Center, a home for healing. A place for remembering. More than a building, it was a refuge, a sanctuary for those carrying the invisible weight of war. PTSD therapy, physical rehab, job training, woodworking shops, and a quiet memorial garden lined with names history had forgotten. The place was made possible by the Marcus Connors Legacy Foundation, approved and championed by none other than General Andrew Price himself. But as the final ribbon was about to be cut, someone was missing from the stage. The man whose name crowned the arch. Franklin Hayes wasn't standing in front of the microphones. He was near the back, off to the side of the crowd, wearing a dark coat over his shoulders, one hand behind his waist, back the other gently holding a white lily. Its edges curled, its color faded. Still, he held it like it mattered, because to him it always had. No one pointed cameras his way. No reporters shoved a mic in his face. But a few who knew gave him subtle nods, men who had once fought beside him or had heard the story of that. Final walk. Franklin didn't wave, didn't speak, he simply watched. He watched as young veterans stepped through the doors of a place built not from fame, but from quiet service. A place born from memory, not ceremony. And for once, that was enough. As the crowd began to thin and the speeches gave way to handshakes, General Price approached. He didn't say anything right away, just stood beside Franklin, hands behind his back, both men looking at the new building, their shared burden, now made real in brick and wood and purpose. Franklin was the first to break the silence. I told you I didn't want a building. Price gave a small, knowing grin. It's not a building. Franklin raised an eyebrow. No, it's a thank you, Price said, etched in stone, for every man who gave more than he got. Franklin looked at the lily in his hand, then back at the wide-open doors of the center. You think they'll come? Price followed his gaze. They already have. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. Franklin turned and started to walk away. Alone, the same way he always had. But something was different now. Not in him. In the world around him. People watched him go. Not with curiosity, but with quiet respect. No one called his name. No one asked for a quote. But they didn't forget him either. Because they knew. Because they'd seen it. Because now, thanks to one final walk, so had the country he never stopped serving. And in the hush of those closing moments, one truth echoed louder than any speech. Some heroes don't wear medals on their chest. They carry them in silence until someone remembers to say, "You never stopped mattering."